Snow swallowed them whole. 300,000 men, gone without a trace. I'm your guide from forgotten history tales, and tonight I step into that white silence where frost and shadows still whisper. Walk with me and uncover why an entire army vanished. The snow falls thick, swallowing the earth in a suffocating silence. I hear nothing but the rasp of frozen breath and the crunch of boots breaking a crust of ice. Around me, shadows move like ghosts, men bent beneath the weight of rifles, carts, and hunger. Their uniforms are ragged, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. No flags flutter, no drums beat. Only the endless white stretches on, indifferent and merciless. I take you with me now to the winter of 1942, the Eastern Front, an ocean of mud turned to ice, where empires bled themselves dry. Here, amid a war of titanic scale, lies a forgotten story. 300,000 soldiers who marched into the abyss, swallowed by snow, swallowed by silence, and never truly returned. The Eastern Front was not merely a battlefield, it was a world unto itself, a graveyard of nations. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 27 million Soviets would perish, alongside millions of Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, and others. But numbers alone cannot describe it. The land itself was the enemy. Rivers that froze into jagged steel, forests that devoured columns, skies that rained fire. In 1942, after the initial German blitzkrieg had thundered into Soviet soil, the war reached its cruel crescendo. The Wehrmacht pressed deep toward Stalingrad, and with them marched allies, men of the Italian Eighth Army, the Hungarian Second Army, and the Romanian divisions. Their task? To guard the vast flanks of the German advance, stretched thin along the Don River. It was a position both thankless and lethal, for it placed underprepared men against the Soviet bear, just as it gathered its strength for a counterstrike. I imagine the men standing there. Many were farm boys from Lombardy, peasants from Transylvania, young Hungarians who had never seen a Russian winter. They were armed with rifles older than themselves, clad in thin wool coats, and told by their commanders that Moscow would soon fall. They were promised glory. Instead, they were given death by frostbite before a shot was ever fired. I walk you through the lines of the Italian Alpini divisions. Their commanders, proud of their mountain heritage, believed they could hold the river crossings. But mountains are not steppes. Here, the horizon never ends. The wind slices through layers of cloth like knives. Horses collapse in the snow, their ribs showing as fodder runs out. One soldier's diary whispers across time. We burn fences, chairs, icons, anything to keep the fire alive. The snow is higher than a man. I can no longer feel my toes. At night, I dream of bread, only bread. To fight a war in such a place was to fight the land itself. The Soviets knew this. They had patience, and they had the weather as their ally. By December 1942, as temperatures dropped below -30, they unleashed Operation Little Saturn, a hammer blow designed not against the Germans directly, but against their allies holding the fragile wings. Imagine the chaos. Soviet T-34 tanks burst through the white haze, their engines rumbling like beasts. Artillery thunder cracked the ice. The frozen dawn turned red. Entire divisions, underfed, underarmed, undersupplied, were shattered in hours. Men who had guarded trenches for months suddenly found themselves cut off, encircled, forgotten by Berlin, abandoned to fate. They tried to retreat. Columns stretched for miles, ragged processions of starving soldiers dragging themselves westward. The snow drank their sweat, their blood, their tears. Frostbite gnawed away fingers and noses. Exhaustion drove some to lie down in the drifts, never to rise again. And here lies the enigma, the haunting silence of history. Officially, 300,000 men vanish from the records of the Eastern Front campaigns. They were not all killed in a single stroke. Many melted into the endless steppe, taken prisoner, marched to camps from which they never returned. Others froze beneath the same snow they marched upon, their bodies hidden until spring thaws revealed them. Too late for names, too late for mourning. I try to imagine what it felt like, not as a historian counting losses, but as one of them, to stand in a wasteland where even time seemed frozen, to see comrades slip into madness, muttering prayers in their mother tongues as the wind howled louder than God, to wonder if one's family would ever know the truth, or if one would simply dissolve into the snow, another unmarked soul in a land that already held millions. War on the Eastern Front was not only about bullets and shells. It was a battle of endurance, men against the very void. And when men vanish in such a void, it is as though the world itself conspires to erase them. But the disappearance of 300,000 soldiers is not mere myth. It is a scar that remains buried under layers of denial, propaganda, and silence. Families back home received only vague telegrams. Missing in action. Villages waited for sons who never came. Some whispered of betrayal, commanders who sacrificed allies to save German divisions. Others believed their men still lived, trapped in Siberian camps, shadows beyond the Iron Curtain. The truth is more complex, more haunting. As I walk among these ghosts of the steppe, I feel the weight of their absence pressing in. The snow still covers their bones. The wind still carries their cries. And the question remains, how does an army vanish, not in a single battle, but in silence, swallowed by both the land and the politics that followed? To answer, we must follow their trail deeper, through the desperate retreats, the frozen rivers, and the black camps of the Gulag, where so many were swallowed whole. The forgotten army is waiting for us still. The silence I left you in, the snow, the endless white, was only the beginning. For silence was broken soon after by the low thunder of Soviet guns. Imagine standing there on the steppe in January 1943, the breath freezing before it leaves your lips, when suddenly the horizon erupts. Shells roar overhead, their trails streaking like meteors across the pale sky, and the ground convulses as though the earth itself has turned against you. The men I walk among do not hear the warning in time. Some are eating thin soup boiled from horse bones. Others huddle in dugouts, rubbing their hands to coax blood back into their fingers. Then the barrage begins. It does not end for hours. The Don's icy banks shatter under fire, and smoke curls upward in black plumes, carried away by a merciless wind. When the bombardment lifts, the tanks come, dozens, then hundreds, their engines rumbling like an avalanche. The Soviet infantry follow, bayonets glinting, cries rising above the crackle of rifles. It is here that the Italian Eighth Army shatters. I see men stumbling from their positions, half deaf, half blind, unsure if they are fleeing east or west. Horses bolt in terror, wagons overturn, shells burst among the retreating columns. Some officers try to rally their troops, waving pistols, shouting orders drowned out by chaos. But the retreat is not orderly. It is an avalanche in reverse, men dissolving into a torrent of fear and desperation. The march westward becomes a death procession. I hear the crunch of thousands of boots on snow, the sobbing of men who know the front has collapsed behind them. Frostbite eats its way into their flesh. blackened toes fall away inside worn boots. They wrap themselves in whatever they can find: straw, rags, even curtains ripped from abandoned peasant houses. One Alpino soldier writes in his diary, "The snow drinks the living." We bury the dead with a glance, then move on, for if we stop, we too will sleep forever beneath it. Villages flicker by, ruined and deserted. Smoke curls from chimneys where Red Army partisans lurk in the forests. Every farmhouse is stripped of food, every barn emptied of hay. The men chew leather straps, gnaw frozen beets, and when hunger becomes unbearable, they slaughter the last horses, cooking the meat over fires fueled by shattered wagons. The smell of burning horseflesh mingles with the stench of unwashed bodies, sweat frozen into uniforms that stiffen like boards. And still, behind them, the Soviets close in. Columns of captured men stumble eastward, herded at bayonet point, while those still free glance back, knowing their fate will be no kinder if caught. Rumors spread like frost, that those taken are marched for weeks until they collapse, that the camps are holes in the earth where men vanish without even the dignity of a grave. The very knowledge gnaws at morale, turning retreat into panic. The Hungarians and Romanians suffer the same. Their armies, stretched thin along the river, are struck in similar fashion. The Hungarian Second Army, once 300,000 strong, disintegrates. Out of that vast host, fewer than 40,000 will ever see home again. Entire battalions are erased in days. The Romanians, ill-equipped and undersupplied, are swallowed in the same wave. It is as though the Soviets had chosen to erase not just armies, but nations from the steppe. I think of the men themselves. Many were farm boys, their mothers' last sons, sent to guard a foreign river in a war not truly theirs. Now they are reduced to shadows in the snow, staggering toward a horizon that offers no sanctuary. At night, the moans echo, men calling for mothers, wives, God. Some fall asleep while marching, collapsing face first into the snow. No one has the strength to carry them. The column presses on, leaving frozen statues behind, their eyes wide open, staring at a sky that will never change. The Germans, meanwhile, do little. Their own divisions reel under the Soviet counterblows, and they cannot spare resources for allies. Supplies are hoarded, promises broken. I can feel the bitterness in the diaries, the anger of men who realize they were pawns in someone else's game. "We are sacrificed," one Romanian officer writes. "Berlin does not care if we die. We are a shield, nothing more." That knowledge cuts deeper than any frost. And still, through all this, there is the mythic endurance of the Alpini. These mountain soldiers, trained to fight among peaks and ridges, now struggle across flat, endless plains. They carry their wounded on sleds improvised from doors. They sing songs in broken voices to keep despair at bay. One survivor recalls, "When the blizzard blinded us, we tied ourselves together with rope, as if we were scaling a mountain. We were not climbing, we were descending into hell. Step by step, mile by mile, their numbers dwindle. Out of entire divisions, only fragments remain. Out of battalions, only squads. Out of squads, sometimes a single man. And as I move with them through this frozen retreat, I feel the weight of the question pressing harder. What happens to those who do not make it? Those who collapse into snowdrifts, or fall into Soviet hands, or vanish without record? 300,000 men cannot simply disappear. Yet here, on the steppe, they do. The march westward is not an escape. It is a narrowing funnel, leading inexorably toward captivity, toward hunger, toward oblivion. The further they walk, the thinner their ranks become, until the columns are no longer armies, but wandering ghosts. And somewhere, just beyond the next horizon, lies the fate that swallowed them whole. I hear the crack of rifles again, the sound of ambushes in the night. The Soviets are not content to let these men retreat. They circle, they harass, they drive the exhausted remnants ever deeper into despair. And as the snow thickens, as the wind roars louder, I realize that the silence I began with has returned. But this time, it is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of extinction. Somewhere in that silence, a decision awaits, whether to march on, to surrender, or to vanish into the white void forever. And it is there, in that decision, that the true disappearance of the forgotten army begins. The silence does not last. It is broken by the sound of boots on ice, boots not belonging to the retreating men, but to their captors. The Soviets tighten their net. By the third week of January 1943, the retreat is no longer a retreat. It is a harvest. Columns of survivors are rounded up at crossroads, in half-burned villages, along the tracks of frozen rivers. Bayonets gleam in the pale sun. Commands bark in Russian, unintelligible to most. Those too weak to lift their hands are shoved, prodded, left to stumble forward or collapse into the snow. I walk alongside one such column now, and I feel the change in atmosphere. Before, in retreat, there had been a flicker of hope that somehow, if they marched fast enough, they might reach safety, regroup, live. Now, as prisoners, that hope curdles into resignation. They shuffle west to east, not east to west, and the horizon is no longer escape, but captivity. The march into the Soviet interior begins with confusion. Men do not know where they are being taken, only that it is away from the front, away from Germany, away from home. They are stripped of weapons, of boots if the Soviets need them, sometimes even of coats. The winter wind cuts deeper into exposed flesh. Guards walk beside them, rifles slung casually, as if the outcome were already certain. And here, the true vanishing begins. The Eastern Front swallows not only bodies but identities. 300,000 men reduced to files, to numbers, to ghosts within a system vast and unrelenting. They are herded into makeshift pens, barns, sheds, frozen fields surrounded by barbed wire. Some die within the first nights, unable to withstand the cold without fire or blankets. Others survive, but only just, gnawing at frozen bread rations, drinking melted snow. Then the long journey east starts, toward the camps, toward the gulag. The transports are brutal. Men are crammed into boxcars meant for cattle, 40, 50, 60 at a time, the doors bolted shut. No heat, no food, no light save for what seeps through cracks in the planks. Days stretch into weeks. They huddle together for warmth, pressed shoulder to shoulder, taking turns near the walls to scratch frost from the wood and let air in. The stench becomes unbearable. Urine, sweat, death. When the train halts, the doors are flung open and bodies are dragged out, stiff as wood, tossed aside without ceremony. The train moves on. I hear the voices in diaries smuggled home years later. An Italian soldier wrote, "We counted each dawn by the number of corpses removed. Sometimes 15, sometimes 20. By the end, half our wagon was gone. We no longer spoke. We just listened for the breath of the man beside us." This is how entire battalions disappear. Not in battle, but in boxcars. By the time they reach the camps, their numbers are already halved. The camps themselves are not places of arrival, but of dissolution. Scattered across Siberia, the Urals, Kazakhstan, they are vast archipelagos of barbed wire and wooden barracks. Prisoners are registered, stripped again, deloused, given numbers. Their names, Italian, Hungarian, Romanian, fade into the dust of ledgers. Here they will work, if they can, felling trees, mining coal, digging frozen earth. The Soviets call it re-education through labor. For many, it is merely annihilation by another name. I step into one of these camps with them. The air is thick with smoke from fires that barely warm the barracks. The wooden bunks are stacked 3 high, crawling with lice. Thin soup ladled once a day, a slice of bread measured by weight, no more. Prisoners shuffle in lines to roll call, their bodies skeletal, their eyes sunken. Guards count, then recount, because the numbers never remain the same. Each night, more vanish. Yet within this horror, human stories flicker like dying embers. Some men carve tiny crosses from splinters of wood. Others sing songs in whispers, fragments of folk tunes that remind them of home. There are friendships formed out of necessity, men keeping each other alive by sheer will, taking turns to give the other their crust of bread, to share warmth under a single ragged blanket. In such moments, survival becomes an act of defiance against the void. But survival is rare. Of the hundreds of thousands marched eastward, only a fraction will live to see freedom. The rest will vanish into the soil of Siberia, their bones unmarked, their names erased. Back home, the waiting begins. Mothers in Lombardy, wives in Budapest, sisters in Bucharest all receive the same telegrams. Missing in action, missing but not declared dead, missing but not confirmed alive. Entire villages live in limbo, staring at empty doorways, keeping candles burning for men who will never walk through them again. For years after the war, rumors swirl of letters smuggled out of camps, of men sighted in far-off towns, of survivors marching home decades later. Some are true. Most are not. And this, too, is part of the vanishing. The uncertainty gnaws as deeply as death itself. To be forgotten is one thing. To be neither dead nor alive in the minds of loved ones is a wound that never closes. The Soviet records speak coldly. Prisoners processed, prisoners transferred, prisoners deceased. But those records were hidden for decades, locked away behind walls of secrecy. The West was left with silence, and silence is fertile ground for forgetting. Yet even as I walk through this silence, I cannot escape the sound that lingers, the shuffle of boots on snow, the cough of a dying man, the cry of another as the train door slams shut. These sounds echo still, trapped in the frozen corridors of time. And as I leave this section of the journey, I sense the next truth waiting for us. The fate of those who survived the camps, who clawed their way back through years of torment, and the long shadow their return would cast upon the families who never stopped waiting. But first, we must descend deeper into the reality of those camps, into the daily grind of starvation, disease, and work without end. The slow erasure of 300,000 souls. The gates of the camps groan as they open, and I step through with them, not as a visitor of history, but as if I, too, were a prisoner shuffled into the endless machinery of survival. The cold is immediate, a knife across the face. Beyond the wire fences, the horizon is flat and colorless, dotted only with the thin silhouettes of barracks and the smoke of low-burning fires. A guard tower looms above, its silhouette a reminder that every movement, every breath, is owned by someone else now. Here, the vanishing no longer comes in bursts of gunfire or collapsing fronts. It comes slowly, methodically, in a rhythm designed to grind men into dust. Each morning begins the same way. Darkness, a whistle, boots thudding on packed snow as prisoners stumble out for roll call. The guards bark numbers, never names. The numbers must balance. If they do not, The men stand longer, shivering in silence, until the missing body is accounted for, either dragged from the barracks or pulled from beneath a thin crust of snow where he froze in the night. Then, with no ceremony, the march begins. Work is everything. To the Soviets, these men are no longer soldiers, but laborers, tools to be used until they break. Some are sent to fell trees in forests where the snow buries the stumps waist-high. Others dig in frozen soil that resists the pickaxe like iron. Still others descend into coal mines, their lungs filling with dust and air already thin from the cold. The hours stretch endlessly, and the wages are meager. A ladle of cabbage water, a hunk of bread measured by grams, sometimes no more than a crust. It is in this calculus that life and death are decided. Those who can work eat enough to stumble through another day. Those too weak are given less, for they cannot earn their ration. Weakness becomes a death sentence, starvation accelerating itself in a spiral. The men know this. They cling to work as if it were breath itself, swinging axes with trembling arms, dragging logs with bodies that weigh little more than shadows. The atmosphere inside the barracks is unbearable. Lice infest every corner. Blankets are shared among 3, sometimes 4. Men cough through the night, hacking blood onto straw mats, while rats scurry to steal crumbs from the day's rations. The stench of unwashed bodies and gangrenous wounds mixes with the acrid smoke of makeshift stoves. Each morning, corpses are removed, quietly, efficiently. Death here is not dramatic. It is routine. And yet, amid this darkness, human spirit flickers. I sit with a group of Italians in one corner. They whisper prayers, murmuring words from the rosary on beads carved from bread hardened like stone. Beside them, a Hungarian hums a folk tune under his breath, so faint it is almost lost to the wind, whistling through cracks in the wood. There are men who sketch maps of their hometowns in the dirt, teaching others the shape of rivers, the color of fields, as if memory itself could become a refuge. One Romanian carves his daughter's name into the beam above his bunk, each letter a protest against being erased. Still, the vast majority slip away. Dysentery spreads quickly. Pneumonia claims lungs already scarred by frost. Starvation thins the body until bones cut through skin. Some prisoners make choices unimaginable to us, bartering boots for bread, abandoning comrades for the chance of survival, stealing what little another has. Yet others hold to dignity, sharing food, sacrificing themselves for friends. In these acts, small, almost invisible, the struggle of humanity against oblivion continues. The guards rarely show mercy. To them, these are enemies, invaders who burned villages and slaughtered civilians. Some relish cruelty, forcing men to stand in the cold for hours, mocking their weakness. But others, quietly, look away when prisoners steal a potato, or let them rest longer than orders permit. Even here, in the architecture of oppression, there are cracks where humanity bleeds through. The psychological burden is worse than the physical. To be far from home, to not know if one's family is alive, to have no certainty of release. This is a torment beyond hunger. Each day bleeds into the next, indistinguishable, as though time itself has been erased. Men forget dates, then seasons, until only the cold and the hunger remain as markers of life. For many, the camps are not simply prisons. They are places where identity dissolves, where men become ghosts before they die. Some do return. After years, after wars end, after diplomacy shifts, survivors stumble back across borders. They are skeletal, scarred, their eyes hollow. They return, not as the men they once were, but as shadows carrying stories that no one wishes to hear. For how can words capture what it means to vanish, to be reduced to a number in a ledger, to see comrades erased day after day? Many choose silence. Others cannot stop speaking, haunted by the faces of those left behind. I think of the mothers and wives waiting still, clinging to hope as letters fail to arrive, as the seasons change, as rumors of survival turn to ash. Some never give up, even decades later, believing their sons live in some distant land, too broken to find their way home. That hope is its own kind of cruelty, endless waiting for footsteps that will never fall again on familiar soil. And yet, the question persists, echoing in the silence of the steppe and the wire of the camps. How does the world forget so many? 300,000 men, swallowed not by a single battle, but by time, by politics, by a war too vast to remember every shadow. They vanish because memory falters. They vanish because it is easier to speak of victories than of losses. They vanish because silence is more convenient than truth. But they are not entirely gone. Their ghosts linger in archives, in diaries smuggled home, in songs whispered in barracks under a pale Siberian moon. And in those fragments lies the next step of our journey, the stories of those who emerged, emaciated but alive, and the uneasy silence that greeted them when they returned to lands that had long since moved on. Yet before we meet the survivors, we must confront the darkest truth, that the majority never left these camps at all. Their bones remain beneath the frozen soil, nameless, faceless, scattered across a continent that chose to forget. And it is there, in the soil itself, that the real scale of this vanishing begins to reveal itself. The soil remembers what men choose to forget. Beneath the thin crust of snow, beneath the blackened earth of Siberian forests and Kazakh steppes, lie the bones of thousands who never walked free again. When the thaw comes, shallow graves yield their secrets, ribs jutting from half-collapsed trenches, skulls with frost still clinging to their sockets, boots rotted but still laced. No markers, no names, only silence. It is here that the true vanishing takes its final shape, not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual, like a candle extinguished not by wind, but by the slow suffocation of air. One man dies of hunger, another of fever, another of despair. Day after day, the camp's numbers dwindle, and the guards record only tallies, never faces. Soon, whole groups are gone, companies, battalions, entire regiments dissolved into statistics. I walk through one of these burial fields in my mind, and I feel the eerie calm that settles there. It is not a battlefield littered with shell casings and the acrid smell of gunpowder. It is a place where men simply ceased to be, where death came not with fire, but with indifference. The silence presses against me, heavy and suffocating. This, I realize, is the greatest cruelty of the forgotten army. Not that they died, but that they disappeared without witness. For the few who survived, the struggle did not end when the war did. Some endured years, even decades behind the wire. They became part of the Gulag archipelago, indistinguishable from millions of others, political prisoners, criminals, enemies of the state. Release was uncertain, dependent not on justice, but on politics. When Stalin died in 1953, a trickle of foreign prisoners began to be repatriated. They returned as old men, broken, unrecognizable even to themselves. I imagine the first moment of return. A survivor steps off the train in Milan, Budapest or Bucharest, his body frail, his face weathered by years of cold and hunger. The family waiting for him does not recognize him at first. The sign, uniform is long gone, replaced by rags. The eyes that once shone with youth are hollow, haunted. Tears flow, embraces are stiff, and yet a shadow lingers between them. For while the survivor has returned, part of him remains in the snow of the steppe, in the smoke of the barracks, in the silence of the graves. And for everyone who came back, there were dozens who did not. Families gathered around kitchen tables, reading the lists of repatriated names published in newspapers, scanning for husbands, sons, brothers. More often than not, the names were absent. No explanations were given. Just absence, like a hole in the page. In villages, women wore black for decades, mourning without bodies, without certainty. Children grew up never knowing if their fathers were alive or dead. This silence was not accidental. After the war, politics buried the story deeper than snow ever could. The Soviets did not wish to speak of the camps, of the men who died under their custody. The Western governments, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Romania, preferred to focus on reconstruction, on the future, not on the uncomfortable past of soldiers lost in a foreign land. Officially, they were listed as missing in action. Unofficially, they were abandoned. I feel the bitterness of this betrayal in the words of survivors. One Italian Alpino recalled, "When we came home, no one wanted to hear our stories. They asked why we had fought in Russia at all, why we had served under the Germans. They saw us not as victims, but as reminders of defeat. So we stayed silent." Silence became another form of erasure. For decades, the forgotten army existed only in whispers, in half-remembered letters, in the private grief of families. Cemeteries did not hold their names. Monuments rarely mentioned them. Even history books skimmed past their fate, preferring the grand battles, Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin, to the slow, anonymous death of allies left behind. And yet, memory has a way of clawing back through the soil. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, archives opened. Documents revealed the true scale of the tragedy. Train manifests, camp records, death certificates by the thousands. Historians pieced together what had been hidden, and families finally learned the truth, that their loved ones had not simply vanished, but had perished far from home, buried in numbers too vast to comprehend. But even this knowledge is incomplete, for the snow keeps its secrets. Many graves remain unmarked, entire contingents swallowed with no record. The earth itself has become their tombstone, stretching from the dawn to Siberia. And I cannot help but wonder, what does it mean for a nation to lose so many in silence? The loss is not only of bodies, but of memory, of identity. These men were erased not just by death, but by history's decision to look away. Their absence is a wound that never healed, a gap in the story of Europe's bloodiest war. The forgotten army remains forgotten, even as we speak of them now. Their story is one of vanishing not just from the battlefield, but from the pages of history, from the lips of their families, from the conscience of the nations that sent them. But their ghosts are not content to rest. They linger, restless in the archives, in the snow, in the silence of abandoned villages. And to truly understand their vanishing, we must follow the survivors who returned, to see how their silence became a shadow cast over generations, and how the burden of memory fell not on armies or states, but on the broken men themselves. It is their voices, faint and trembling, that will lead us further into the mystery of how an entire army could vanish not in defeat, but in silence. The silence of the camps follows the survivors home like a second shadow. When I walk with them back into their villages, years after the war, I feel the gulf between those who waited and those who endured. Doors open, embraces are shared, tears fall. But beneath it all lies a tension, unspoken and heavy. The men who return are not the same, and the families who waited have been living with ghosts for too long. For many survivors, homecoming is not a triumph, it is dislocation. They step onto familiar streets only to feel estranged, as if the world had moved on without them. Children grown tall do not recognize their fathers. Wives remarried or widowed in all but name hesitate at the sight of strangers in rags. Communities whisper behind curtains, "Why did he return when so many others did not?" Survivors' guilt becomes another prison, invisible but unbreakable. I sit with one man in my mind's eye, an Italian Alpino who survived years in a Siberian camp. His face is hollow, his hands tremble. He tries to describe what he saw, what he suffered, but words fail. Around him, neighbors ask about Stalingrad, about the battles, about heroism. He shakes his head, because his war was not fought in glory, but in hunger, in lice, in the slow erosion of humanity. When he speaks of comrades left behind, of men frozen in snowdrifts, of songs whispered in the dark, the listeners avert their eyes. They do not want to hear, and so silence deepens. Survivors learn to keep their memories locked inside. They bury them beneath daily life, work, marriage, rebuilding. Yet the memories claw their way out in nightmares. In the quiet of night, screams echo through small village houses, startling wives and children. Some men wake believing they are still in the camps, clawing for air, expecting the guard's whistle at dawn. Trauma lingers like frostbite, invisible but crippling. Governments, too, prefer silence. Italy, Hungary, and Romania, all battered, all politically fragile, have no interest in reopening wounds. To acknowledge the scale of loss would be to admit complicity in a war that many citizens wish to forget. The men who returned are given little recognition, often branded collaborators for having fought under German command. Monuments are scarce. Pensions are meager. The survivors feel not like soldiers honored, but like burdens carried reluctantly by states eager to look forward. And yet memory does not vanish entirely. In small circles, survivors gather. They form associations, veterans groups, places where silence breaks and words can finally be spoken. Here, in dim meeting halls or cafes, they exchange stories that no one else wants to hear. They compare the names of comrades, trace the journeys of those who vanished, remember the songs of the march across the dawn. In these fragile communities, memory endures like an ember shielded against the wind. The mythic aura of their suffering grows in whispers. Among families, the absent become figures of legend, uncles, fathers, brothers whose stories are told half in fact, half in imagination. Children hear of men lost to the snows, swallowed by Siberia, walking still across an endless white horizon. For those who wait, myth becomes easier than truth, because truth is too heavy to bear. And in this myth lies another cruelty. For while the survivors live, they are haunted by the knowledge that their comrades' names are fading into oblivion. 300,000 souls reduced not just by death, but by indifference. They carry the weight of remembrance alone, like men dragging sleds across the frozen steppe, knowing they will never reach the end. I hear it in their testimonies decades later, when historians finally come to record their voices. An old Hungarian soldier whispers into a microphone, "We sang so they would not forget us." But when we came home, no one wanted to listen. Our silence became their forgetting. The tragedy deepens when one realizes how deliberate that forgetting was. Cold War politics drew iron curtains not only across Europe, but across memory itself. In the West, the fate of these soldiers was inconvenient. In the East, it was shameful. Silence suited everyone but the dead. And yet, I feel their presence still, in archives, in letters smuggled home, in fragments carved into wood or stone. The soil of Russia and Ukraine still holds them. Their voices linger, restless, demanding not to be forgotten. The survivors, those few who lived long enough, carry that demand into old age. They write memoirs, give interviews, leave behind testimonies scrawled in trembling hands, but always there is the shadow of guilt. Why me, they ask. Why did I live when so many others did not? No answer comes, only silence. And it is this silence, layered, deliberate, suffocating, that we must peel back to see the final truth. Not just how these men vanished, but how history itself conspired to erase them. For beyond the battlefield, beyond the camps, lies the politics of forgetting and the deliberate decision to bury memory deeper than the graves themselves. That is where we must go next, into the archives, into the politics, into the cold machinery of states that found it easier to let 300,000 vanish than to confront their loss. The silence is not accidental. It is constructed. The silence, I told you, was constructed, and now I step with you into the smoke-filled rooms where that silence was designed. The war ends in 1945, yet for the 300,000 who vanished on the Eastern Front, the war never ends at all. Their bodies remain scattered across frozen soil, their names buried in Soviet archives, and their memory stifled by the politics of nations desperate to move forward. In Moscow, the Soviet Union has little interest in publicizing the scale of foreign prisoners lost in its vast camps. To admit the numbers would be to acknowledge responsibility for thousands of deaths beyond the battlefield, deaths that could not be excused as the chaos of war. Stalin's regime, already steeped in secrecy, ensures the files are locked away. Prisoner lists, death records, transport manifests, all sealed in steel cabinets, hidden behind a bureaucracy as cold as Siberian ice. In Berlin, the reckoning takes another shape. Germany, shattered and divided, clings to its own narrative of loss and destruction. To account for the dead allies would be to admit betrayal, that in the desperate gamble of Stalingrad, entire armies of Hungarians, Italians, and Romanians had been sacrificed to protect German divisions. Better, for Berlin, to let silence stand, to allow these men to vanish quietly while attention shifted to the rebuilding of a broken Reich. And in Rome, Budapest, Bucharest, the silence deepens. These nations are broken, occupied, politically fragile. Italy shifts between monarchy, fascism, and fragile democracy. Hungary and Romania fall into Soviet influence, their governments bent to the will of Moscow. For them, the vanished soldiers are a problem without solution. To speak of them would be to question alliances, to inflame grief that could turn against the state. So officials draft reports filled with half-truths, missing in action, presumed dead. That phrase becomes the final shroud over thousands of lives. I feel the weight of this betrayal in every word of testimony. Survivors who return find no honor, no monuments. Some are even treated with suspicion, accused of collaboration, tainted by association with German command. Their suffering in Soviet captivity becomes an uncomfortable reminder of a war their nations want to erase. Instead of recognition, they are met with cold bureaucracy, denied pensions, told their pain is not useful to the new political order. Meanwhile, families wait in limbo. Mothers clutch photographs until the edges crumble. Wives keep wedding rings on their fingers decades after hope has withered. children grow into adults carrying only fragments of memory. In many villages, the war never truly ends because the absence is never explained. It is not death they live with, but uncertainty. And uncertainty breeds myth. Stories circulate of soldiers seen wandering the Siberian forests, of long marches home decades later, of men who appear in distant towns with no memory of who they are. Some are true. Rare survivors staggering home in the 1950s, even 1960s, released quietly from camps. But most are whispers born of longing, of refusal to let go. Hope becomes its own kind of cruelty, a wound reopened each time a rumor spreads. When the Cold War tightens its grip, the silence calcifies. To speak of the vanished army becomes dangerous. In Hungary, in Romania, the new communist regimes have no tolerance for stories that highlight Soviet cruelty. In Italy, divided between left and right, the fate of soldiers who fought under Mussolini's banners is politically toxic. So memory is driven underground, kept alive only in private diaries, in gatherings of veterans, in the quiet prayers of families who refuse to forget. Decades pass this way. Generations grow up with absences at their tables, with questions unanswered. The war fades into history, yet for those touched by the vanished army, it never fades at all. And still, the archives remain locked, the truth hidden behind red stars and iron curtains. It is not until the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the silence finally cracks. For the first time, documents spill out, ledgers listing names, records of transport trains, death certificates scrawled in Russian cursive. Historians dig, families search, and the scale of the vanishing becomes clear. Hundreds of thousands taken eastward, most never to return. The numbers are staggering, the truth undeniable, and yet, even then, the recognition comes too late for most. The mothers are gone, the wives buried, the children grown old themselves. Survivors who still breathe are few, their voices faint, trembling, but fierce with urgency. They testify before cameras, into microphones, onto paper. They speak not for themselves alone, but for the comrades who never returned, whose bones remain scattered across the steppe. One Hungarian veteran says it best. History forgot us because it was easier that way, but forgetting is another kind of death. We lived so they would not be erased. I cannot shake his words. They linger like smoke after a fire. The silence was deliberate, yes, but memory has a way of clawing through soil and steel alike. And as the archives open, as survivors speak, as monuments finally begin to rise, the forgotten army begins, slowly, painfully, to be remembered. But remembrance is fragile. It depends on us, on whether we listen, whether we carry their story forward. And so I leave you with the truth that leads us toward our final step. The vanished did not vanish by accident. They were taken by war, by cold, by starvation, and then by silence. To break that silence, to keep them from vanishing a second time, is the task that remains. And it is here, in this act of remembering, that we must face the last haunting truth of the forgotten army. The truth at last lies before us, but it does not roar. It whispers. It whispers through the frostbitten pages of diaries, through the trembling voices of survivors recorded in old age, through the silence of villages that lost their sons and never saw them again. 300,000 men did not simply disappear into the white void of the Eastern Front. They were taken first by hunger and frost, then by captivity, and finally by the silence of politics that found forgetting more convenient than remembrance. I return with you now to that endless snowfield where this story began. The horizon is as flat and merciless as ever. the wind cutting across the steppe like a blade. I see them again, long columns of soldiers, stumbling, half-starved, their breath steaming in the frozen air. Their faces blur in the distance, dissolving into mist as if history itself were erasing them. That is the image that has haunted Europe for 80 years, an army swallowed whole, not by battle alone, but by the indifference that followed. And yet, as I linger in this landscape of ghosts, I feel a shift. For their memory, long buried, has begun to claw its way back into the world. In Italy, plaques now bear the names of Alpini who never came home. In Hungary, memorials mark the catastrophe of the Second Army. In Romania, families still light candles each year for the vanished. Across Europe, scholars and descendants dig through archives, piecing together the fragments of a tragedy once erased. The silence is breaking, but only just. Still, remembrance is fragile. It flickers like a candle in a storm. The survivors, those who bore witness, are almost all gone now. With them vanish the last living voices of the forgotten army. What remains are their testimonies, brittle photographs, skeletal entries in ledgers once hidden in Soviet vaults. Memory must shift from the personal to the collective, from the lips of those who lived it to the hearts of those who choose to listen. And so the responsibility falls to us, to you, listening now, to refuse the comfort of forgetting, to hold on to the truth that an army of men, fathers, sons, brothers, were erased, not because they lacked courage, but because the world found it easier to let them vanish. Their story is not simply about the past. It is a warning etched in ice that silence can kill as surely as bullets, and that memory is the only shield against oblivion. I take you back once more into the camps, into the barracks where men carved names into wooden beams so that someone, someday, would remember. Those names are faint now, eaten by time, but they still exist. Each one is a cry against erasure. Each one is a demand. Do not forget us. And so, the story ends not with their disappearance, but with our choice. Will we let them fade a second time, lost again in the snowdrifts of history? Or will we carry their voices forward, speaking of them not as ghosts, but as men who lived, suffered, and deserved remembrance? I leave you here, at the edge of the white silence, where the wind howls across the steppe and the past presses close. 300,000 men march into the mist. Most will never return, but as long as we speak of them, as long as we carry their memory, they are not entirely lost. The forgotten army waits in the snow still, waiting not for rescue, but for remembrance. And now that you have heard their story, they need never vanish again.